Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So, welcome. I'm Martin Evans. I'm U+I's Creative Director. Thank you all for joining us at our latest U+I Think. We created this series of events to challenge perceptions, inspire debate in our industry, and to get us all to think a little bit beyond the traditional boundaries of the property built environment industry we all find ourselves in most days. We've had an amazing series of events, particularly since lockdown, when we took our events online. Today we're going to talk about heritage, a subject that fills developers particularly with equal measures of fear and inspiration. Here at U+I, we see it as one of the most basic ingredients that allows us to do what we do. We find it odd that you can even contemplate the future of a place if you can't understand its past. In a piece my colleague Richard Upton's just written, he said, "Heritage is the kind of place, is the king of placemaking. It infuses the built environment with stories and meaning. Those stories fuel our sense of identity, and that in turn makes us feel happy and safe." And what else do we want for the places that we make together, other than that they make those who use them happy and safe? I feel very lucky today to be able to introduce you to Tristram Carfrae. My good friend Morag Myerscough sent me a very excited email a little while ago telling me about an event she'd been to where she'd heard Tristram talk about his work at the Sagrada Família. She was completely captivated. And when someone whose judgment I trust implicitly tells me something like that, I make a point of listening. And that's why we've ended up in the very nice position today of having Tristram here as our guest to talk to us about one of the most extraordinary building projects anywhere in the world. Tristram's day job is as Deputy Chair of Arup, and in that role he's been responsible for many award-winning buildings, including the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games Water Cube and in London Coldrops Yard. He's collaborated with a roll call of some of the most accomplished architects and designers in the world, from Renzo Piano and Norman Foster to Thomas Heatherwick and Richard Rogers, and that's just for starters. And he was awarded the prestigious gold medal of the Institution of Structural Engineers in 2014. But Tristram's latest passion project, and what we're here to talk about today, is Gaudi's wonderful Sagrada Família in Barcelona. In 2015, Tristram was commissioned to help complete this spectacular basilica with a deadline of 2026. Given that construction began on this project in 1882, you might imagine the authorities in control would want to set a PC date. We've got some long-term projects in our portfolio, but none that challenge our IRR to that degree. So the target that they set for Tristram is to complete the remaining structure in the next 6 years for the centennial of Gaudi's death. But without a set of original plans even, how do you finish one of the world's most famous buildings? So I'm very much hoping that Tristram is going to tell us. Tristram's going to talk to us for about 3/4 of an hour, and then he's kindly agreed to take questions. So you can all submit questions using the button on your toolbar, the little Q&A speech bubbles with the question mark in them. Please don't hesitate to type as Tristram's talking. I can gather the questions on a screen here on my laptop. And we're planning to be done by about 5:30. You can also, if we can't get through all the questions by the time we finish, I'll see what we can do about seeing whether there is a way that we can on our website try to provide some answers to some of them. So, Tristram, enough from me, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martin. That's a very kind introduction. I hope you can all hear me.
Yep.
I had some difficulty there unmuting my mic, so I'm just checking it was working. So here we go, Sagrada Família, my favourite project, as Martin has said. Not just my favourite project today, but my favourite project of all time. So here we go. This is what Sagrada was looking like a couple of years ago. This is the major east facade, the nativity facade. Before I begin, this slide is to remind me to tell you that, of course, all great projects, and this is no exception, is about a collaborative endeavour. It's got lots of people involved. I have a bad habit of talking as though I'm the only person involved and get carried away. But of course, in this case, it's a very particular organisational structure. We have the client is the Sagrada Família Foundation, but they are also the architect and the builder, and in fact organise the whole of the supply chain. So we've got the only outside parties or external parties are 2BMFG, who are a firm of Catalan engineers who've been working on the project for the last 25 or 30 years, and us, the newcomers, who've been only on the project for 5 years, helping out with the structure, and I'll explain why that came to pass shortly. So I'll start with a bit of the history, the last 130 years. You know, this, if you like, is the continuing heritage piece that Martin referred to earlier. So this, back in 1851, now some 170 years ago, Barcelona, the city, set down this plan for their extension, the Eixample. So they drew up a plan of these very characteristic octagonal blocks, so square blocks with the corners cut off, forming a little public square at the corner of every street intersection. And the most amazing thing really is that this is Barcelona today, and what you can see is that for 150 years they followed that plan. It wasn't just a drawing that was put away, it was something that was actually made real over more than a century. There is a slight difference between the two. If I go back to the original plan, you can see most of the blocks were only planned to have buildings on 2 sides or maybe 3, with public open space through the centre of the block. But of course, over time, land has become so valuable and development so with so much potency that what you've got is almost all blocks are now built on all 4 sides, and in fact most of them are filled in the centre as well, although there's now a movement to open them up again to create at least private space in the centre, if not public space. But enough of that. The yellow circle is the site of Sagrada itself. You can see its relationship to the coast at the bottom, and also to the Gothic quarter, which is the dense area down in the southwest of the site. You can see it here better. The black area is the Gothic quarter, already pre-existed the Eixample. So when Sagrada was first planned, it was a private organisation, the devotees of St. Joseph, who got together and raised funds to build a church for the people, and they employed an architect called Villar. He was a well-known, established, reputable architect, and he drew up a relatively modest neo-Gothic church that you can see on your screens, hopefully in front of you. And that church was well under construction when we get to 1882, when Villar fell out with his client. Not an unheard of thing to happen for architects, I think, to have disagreements with their clients, but in this case, the disagreement was taken so far that Villar resigned from the project and refused to continue. But at this stage, the crypt that you can see in front of you, the basement, was already more or less constructed. The devotees of St. Joseph then took the rather extraordinary decision to appoint Antoni Gaudi, you see here in front of you on the left. Gaudi at that time was just 30 years old, and he'd never built anything more than this glove stand at the World's Fair of 1878. So he had no track record at all architecturally at the time of his appointment. He went on, of course, to become one of the leading architects of the 20th century, and certainly of the Modernista period in Barcelona. And you can see here his design for Mr. Güell, the great industrialist who is mainly his sponsor. So this is Palau Güell, Mr. Güell's own house. This is one of the external buildings at Park Güell, which was an experiment in urban living. The idea of how do you build beautiful villas for the middle classes amongst leafy foliage on the outskirts of Barcelona. And here's Casa Bayo, one of the most glorious buildings he designed, I think, that you can go and visit. And what you'll notice from all of these is that at the time of Gaudi's appointment, he was sort of related, I guess, to the arts and crafts movement of the UK. He was into craftsmanship, organic shapes and forms, and decorative arts, not strictly architectural, although that came later. And here is a building that's sort of in transition. This is the Casa Mia, a block of apartments in Barcelona. It's got the most amazing facade made out of stone, but it's not actually load-bearing stone. There's a steel frame in behind this. And one, I think, an incredible thing is that in the basement, accessible via a spiral ramp through the front door, built in 1908, is an underground car park. Now, his foresight to think he needed an underground car park in 1908 when there are probably only about 3 cars on the road of Barcelona at any one time, it's quite extraordinary. And up on the top of La Pedrera, or Casa Mia, is this public open space again. So the idea is he tries to make every bit of the building usable. So here's a place to perambulate around the rooftops in amongst the laundry, for people. And take notice of the chimney pot on the left-hand side of your screen, because we're going to see that again later. So anyway, Gaudi had no experience when he was appointed to Sagrada, but he had absolutely no lack of ambition. He took Mr. Villa's blue outline church, you see on the right, and decided to build the red outline church, the Sagrada Família that we are now all so familiar with. Not only did he do that, but he thought the views of his church were better at an angle than they were at the perpendicular. So rather than the pure elevations, he liked these skew views. And this is his own drawing. And you can see the blue outlines of the views that he thought were nice, typically at about 60 degrees, off center. And therefore he suggested that the surrounding blocks were not actually completed, but were cut back, to allow views of this wonderful church that he was creating. And the strangest thing is it actually came to pass, at least to some extent, because you'll see the yellow circle again is the sort of site of Sagrada. The blocks to the left and the right have both remained vacant and turned into parks. And this right angle, this 45-degree avenue that leads up to another modernista building, the Hospital de la Santa Cruz, was also established and is appropriately named the Avenue Gaudi. This slide is to remind me to tell you that I usually work in a sort of intersection of architecture, structural engineering and construction. That's my sort of happy hunting ground, if you will. But for this project, there's also theology. Every part of the church has theological meaning. And this is, again, an early drawing showing the meaning of all the different components. And so it's no good me saying we don't need 7 columns in this area, we can make do with 4. If I've forgotten that there are 7 deadly sins and 7 virtuous graces. So we will have 7 columns whether we need it or not. So it's another facet to design which I was unfamiliar with, but have now become quite used to. So Gaudi, after his appointment, spent the first 20 or so years working on multiple projects, but the last 20 years he devoted entirely to Sagrada. And this is the state of construction when he died in 1926. So you can see on the left he completed the apse around the main north end of the church, and he completed the east entrance, the side door, the nativity facade that you can see on the right. And the nativity facade is in its own right, a absolutely incredible work of art. Its theme is life. It's about life coming out of the primordial soup in the background, as well as the sort of classical nativity story in classical sculptures, in the foreground. And it's got some also Gaudi twists, some humour. Under the left-hand column, left-hand side of the main door is a turtle, because that way lies the sea. But under the right-hand column is a tortoise, because that way lies the land. So every time I go to Sagrada, I can read more and more into what I see and see more details. And you see here more details of the sculpture. On the left, amazing hanging stones, which are done in pure masonry. There's no tension elements holding it up. On the right, the classical sculpture of the Nativity itself sitting right in the middle of the main doors. And the main doors themselves, these amazing cast bronze doors, were only installed 3 years ago. So, even something supposedly finished 100 years ago is still undergoing its finishing touches 100 years later. Which brings me to another point about Sagrada. It's my observation that this project lifts people in their abilities. It somehow gets under their skin and causes them to do things that they might otherwise not have done. So this doors the work of a wonderful Japanese now sculptor called Sotu. And so Mr. Sotu joined the team in 1978 as a stonemason with a hammer and a chisel. And he went on from there to do classical sculpture, and some of the musicians you can see on the left are his work. And he's now in charge of the whole decorative arts program at Sagrada and has personally responsible for these doors. So we get to 1926. In 1926, this is what you see. You can see that the city has begun to reach Sagrada. It wasn't really present when Sagrada started. You can see the state of construction, and it's slightly odd maybe that it was built from the ground upwards rather than in two places, rather than what would normally happen is you get just the foundations and the beginnings of the walls all the way around. And this is probably so that they could raise funds, a big advertising hoarding, if you like, as to what was going to happen there in the future. But then in 1926, Gaudi, on his way to evensong, he'd become a very aesthetic person at that point in his life. He used to live under his bench in the church, in the drawing office. He didn't go home. He had a villa at Parkwell, but he didn't go home most evenings. But anyway, on his way to prayers, he was struck by a tram and unfortunately was dead instantly. We then had the Spanish Civil War in the 20s, which had other unfortunate consequences, because one of the victims of the war was the drawing office where all the plaster models, 1 to 10 scale plaster models, were kept. And the models were blown into smithereens and the drawings went up in flames. Fortunately, most of the drawings, or a lot of them anyway, had been lent out or published in books in the fundraising efforts over the 40 years preceding. And therefore they could be recovered to a large extent. And the models, a few of them were re-pieced back together. People are still patiently sitting in the basement of Sagrada trying to glue bits of plaster of Paris back to make coherent things. And from that work, the building was able to continue, although it wasn't until the 50s that the work on the Passion facade, the west entrance on the other side of the church, began. On the left, you see Gaudi's own drawing. So Gaudi didn't draw in a technical drawing sense. Gaudi drew in this more artistic sketch sense, and that's one of his drawings there on the left. And here you see the completed Passion facade. The cross on the top was only put on 2 years ago, so again it's reached fruition eventually. And what you see here, of course, is a completely different artistic style to the one on the other side of the church. So life is carved in an organic fashion, and death is this cubist, straight, harsh, angular fashion with sculptures to suit by a guy called Joseph Superax, again a local sculptor who was unknown on his appointment. The arts intelligentsia, if you like, of Barcelona objected to his appointment, but he turned out these wonderful creations. And in there you can see here the soldiers in the middle, or riding the horse on the left, that their helmets are actually the chimney pots from Casimir, as Superax takes a nod, or provides a nod to the original designer of the church, Mr. Gaudi. So Gaudi started as an arts and crafts architect, a decorative architect, but he changed over his life. So his first sketches for Sagrada, you can see here, the first version, is again a more sort of neo-Gothic, classically neo-Gothic design. It has modernist elements, more strict geometry than usual, and it has one particular structural form, which is he didn't want to have either buttresses or flying buttresses outside the church. A, because he thought they shouldn't be necessary, and B, because they prevented light coming in through the windows, and he wanted the most airy and light-filled interior possible. But you can see in the centre of the left-hand section this idea of a great big catenary arch, an arch which would carry load vertically downwards without creating thrust, sideways loads requiring buttresses on the outside. And you can see here the back of the Nativity facade, because the Nativity facade was actually constructed in accordance with this first design, so that it is in this neo-Gothic, but slightly angular approach. His second version is the one in front of you, where he is now trying harder to make the structure actually line up with the forces. You can see on the left, the columns in the center of the diagram aren't vertical. You can see how the load travels down the building, but he's still got where the columns branch. He's put in layers, platforms for the branching, which you can see in the middle and on the right. Actually, none of the church is constructed in this design, because he then developed this technique for designing structure of masonry. His logic was that if masonry can only take compression, because otherwise the joints will open if you apply tension, then if we design the perfect tension structure upside down, then we can invert it and make it from masonry. So what you see in front of you is a hanging chain model where every sandbag has some lead shot in it, and the lead shot precisely add up to the weight of the masonry at that point in the church. But as you change the weight in the lead bags, it changes the shape of the church, which changes the amount of masonry at that point, and you have to change the lead shot in all the bags. And so it's a very iterative, time-consuming, painstaking process. So while this model is in the basement of the Sagrada Família in the museum there, it isn't actually of any part of Sagrada itself. It is instead the hanging chain model for this chapel to be built at a place called Colonia Güell. So Park Güell was the experiment in sort of urban living or suburban living, and Colonia Güell was an experiment in rural living, a community of its own outside of Barcelona. Unfortunately, only the crypt you see in front of you of the chapel was actually built, but it does go to highlight what the issues were with this approach to construction. The main issue is simply that nothing is vertical, and therefore it's quite a confusing space to be in because there's no way to orient yourself. You can also see that Gaudi, I think, took a very experimental approach to it, because he used brick, he used concrete, he used solid basalt columns, he used every construction technique almost he could think of. And I think this was experimenting with things to see what they look like before bringing them into play at Sagrada itself. But anyway, the third design for Sagrada, the one that's actually the nave is constructed from, shows on the left now a very, very pure skeletal structure following exactly the force lines from the masonry devolved from this hanging chain approach. He's removed the platforms where the columns branch, so he's trusting that the branch angles are now correct for the loads being applied. But what he's done in the other direction is he just takes this cross section and repeats it exactly every 7.5 meters the whole way along the church. And this gives the order and the rhythm that allows you, I think, to order yourself and make it all work, because the columns aren't actually vertical in the section you see on the left, but they are vertical in the other direction. So they only lean one way, and that seems to be sufficient to resolve everything. And here you see the nave itself being built in the 1990s and through to the 2000s, and it's marching towards you every 7.5 meters towards the main entrance. The nativity facade's on the right, the passion facade on the left, the far end is the apse and the crypt, and coming towards you, you will eventually get to the main entrance. And this is what it looks like inside. It was completed as an internal space in 2010 and consecrated by the Pope. And I think it's one of the most beautiful and uplifting spaces you'll ever go into. It's got some beautiful touches, like on the right, the stained glass is all green and yellow, and that's because that's the easterly direction. That's where the morning sun comes in. And on the left, it's more warmer colours, red and orange, because that's where the afternoon, the western sun comes in. And the stained glass up at the top is actually crystal clear, not coloured at all. And this is to get the light up at the top of the church, because a lot of the medieval cathedrals are really quite gloomy, and they're quite maybe oppressive because they're not very well lit, particularly at height. Gaudi's second sort of step, apart from making everything structurally perfect, was then to become an absolute devotee of geometry. And the piece of geometry he chose was what we would now call a ruled surface, a surface that can be defined by straight lines, at least in one direction. And on the left, you see here a model of a hyperboloid, which is a surface of revolution, similar to be used in water towers at power stations, for example. And his other primary surface was the hyperbolic paraboloid, which is a twisted square. And on the right, you can see the ceiling of the nave is entirely constructed out of hyperboloids. And even the decorative elements, those teeth hanging down between the hyperboloids, yes, are actually the intersection of the straight lines between two adjacent hyperboloids. So, and the tiling follows the straight lines. And it's a beautiful surface to use because the straight lines give it a way of order and a way of making it. And we'll talk again about that later. So here, two more massive hyperboloids. The left-hand one is underneath the main tower, above the crossing in the middle of the church. The right is the one above the apse, which is also above the crypt. And this one, the yellow triangle you see there glistening, actually represents God, his or herself, being illuminated from above. So the big towers I'm going to talk about later are actually also lanterns, bringing natural light into the body of the church. And here you see the reflected ceiling plan, or actually really the true ceiling, looking upwards to the crossing. Below you, you can see the representation of God and the apse. To the left, you can see the Passion facade. To the right, the Nativity facade. And up the page is the nave itself. And at the end of the nave will be the main entrance, the Glory facade. So that's the first 130 years. And then we get to 2015, when the good client, Sagrada Família Foundation, came to visit us in London and explained that they had some challenges. This was the state of construction at the time. You can see that it's actually only about 60% built in 2015, and they've just made a decision to complete the church by 2026, as Martin said, the centenary of Gaudi's death. So that leaves you with 40% of the church yet to build in 10 years. On the left at the bottom there, you can also see a shed. That's actually a stonemason's yard. You can't really tell here, but above on the main roof, which hasn't been completed yet, is the timber yard. Inside, or in front of the main roof, you can just see a lean-to arrangement. That's the batching plant for concrete. All of these things have to be removed from site in order for us to be able to complete the project. And this is the amount of construction still left to be done. So in the foreground, you can see the two sacristies, one of which has now been completed, but wasn't completed 5 years ago. This is the Mary Tower, the first of the big towers on top, the one that sits above the apse and the crypt. There you can see the main roof, the structure, the room called the crossing underneath the main towers. Here's the bottom of the evangelist towers, the 4 towers that surround the main towers. This is the pediment of the Passion facade, and I've already shown you that that's complete already. At the front entrance, we have the 2 baptistries on either side, and then we have the main entrance itself with 4 more bell towers and this amazing canopy hanging out over the street. We have the 4 evangelist towers that surround the main Jesus Tower itself. So when complete, the Jesus Tower, complete with an inhabitable cross at the top, or accessible cross, will be 172.5 meters tall, making Sagrada Família the tallest building in Barcelona, the tallest church in the world, but still 1 meter shorter than Montjuic Hill, because Gaudi thought it wasn't polite to challenge God. So on the left here, you can see the challenge sort of writ large. We've built the dark brown bit, but we haven't yet built or even designed the pale brown piece, and we want to achieve what you can see on the right, the final construction of this wonderful church. And to do that, we have to speed up the rate of construction by a factor of 10. The second part of the challenge is a legacy of villas. That the Mary Tower, the front of the big 6 towers, sits vertically above the crypt, and the crypt, when it was designed, had no idea that it had to support anything of this magnitude and weight, and therefore the foundations literally couldn't support it. We know the geometry of the Mary Tower because one of the models that was pieced back together again was this model on the left of the sacristy, and the Mary Tower's geometry is similarly made from the intersection of some vertically oriented hyperbolic paraboloids you see on the right here that rotate about the central axis, and where they intersect is what gives you this this tower shape. And now we can do all of that with Rhino and Grasshopper, and then extend it to 14 faces and the height of the Mary Tower, and this is what you get. This is the tower that was fully designed architecturally before the foundation came to approach us to talk about the structure. But the problem was that you couldn't build this in masonry conventionally and support it on the crypt that was already completed, which you can just see in the bottom left of the section on the left hand side of the diagram. The solution being proposed by the client at that time was to build a steel frame and then clad it with lightweight cladding panels that looked like stone. So from the outside, you could be fooled into thinking you were looking at a masonry tower, but inside it would be a bit like going around the back of a Hollywood Western set, and you'd see the scaffolding or pipework arrangement to hold it up. And the third part of the challenge is simply, which we took very seriously, is how do you maintain the quality of this amazing project? This project's been already under construction for 130 years. There are a lot of people who think it shouldn't be completed at all because nobody can match Gaudi's talent. And there are others who feel, you know, it should remain as a building site because that's more interesting than a completed church. But of course, for the client, they want to complete a church, but to the highest possible quality. So the first thing that we did is to say, well, what else do we know? What do we know that would help us meet this challenge? And the first thing we said is we knew quite a lot actually about steelwork. We just completed the Cheese Grater or Leadenhall building in London with Richard Rogers. We'd also completed the Orbit out at Olympic Park with Anish Kapoor. These are examples of complex steelwork. But back in the 90s, we had made this slightly strange stone facade for a pavilion at the Seville Expo. And this was a project I'd worked on with the late Peter Rice. And here we were trying to see how little stone you actually need. Stone is in a medieval cathedral is using about 2% of its capacity. So what happens if we start using, let's say, 10% of its capacity and use steel to keep it stable? Because that's what the bulk of the stone in a cathedral is doing, is stabilizing it against thrusts and tensions. We'd done this church with Renzo Piano in Rome, Padre Pio, where they're also load-bearing stone, in this case internally post-tension using steel strand. And in Sydney, where I've spent a lot of my life, I'd done this sculpture in sandstone blocks using stainless steel rods, also post-tension to hold the blocks together, which is how you can get this arching action. So we began to think, you know, is there a way of actually building it in stone, but within the weight limit of the crypt? And my way of working is to use a computer to try and work this out. My head is not big enough to work out, you know, how structures in three-dimensional shapes and forms really work. So I built a finite element model in a structural analysis program. This is just 6 panels out of the whole model of 14 stories and 14 stories and 14 panels per story. And what I found out was that as a stone panel of only 300 millimeters thickness, we didn't have a structure. You see, if the wind blows, this is what happens. The green is compression that the stone is quite happily taking, and the red, though, is tension that the stone is unable to take because it just pulls the joints apart. So this is the worst case panels under the worst load conditions, but you can see we just don't have enough weight to hold the tower down against the forces of nature trying to push it sideways. But if we insert steel rods into these stone panels and post-tension them together, we pre-compress all the stone. So this is the compression field that you can generate with a few strategically placed rods. And now when the wind blows, you don't get that net tension because it doesn't really overcome the compression. There are a few little areas of tension, but they're not anything that will cause anything to break. Just locally we'll get joints opening up by sort of a fraction of a millimeter and then closing again when the wind passes. So we took this to the client and the architect and said, what about it? This to us looks like a good strategy. And the amazing thing about Sagrada is they are also the builder. And the builder was very keen to try out this new strategy. He wanted to know how easy was it to build? You know, did he like it? Did it save time? Was it easy to do? And so within a month, they had made a panel. They had cut a set of stones. You can see here the 20mm rods holding it all together. And you can see here it being lifted up, you know, to make sure it works in all different directions. And I love the fact that actually it's being lifted up vertically above the place where Gaudi himself did all his experiments. There's a bit of a hollow below you in the ground where he could do experiments out of sight of the passing public. And here you see the happy team. You know, that we were, the builder is the second from the left, and he's overjoyed at this experiment. It said it took him a day to put it together. And if you were doing anything similar that, you know, to make a lightweight panel, he thought it might take him a week. And an advantage for us as engineers is we can now test it. We know that the computer says it works, but was the computer right? You know, is the computer modeling reality accurately enough? Have we made the right assumptions, etc.? So what you see here is this big jack in the foreground is pushing it sideways in the same way as the tower will when the wind blows. And we test it out to make sure that it behaves the way we're expecting it to behave. And I'm glad to say it did. So a little intermission here, which is to say that projects are all about teamwork, and to get teamwork, you have to have communication. And I've never worked on a project with richer communication. And I think it might be because we don't speak Catalan, and our Catalan colleagues, you know, can speak English, but it's a bit of a struggle. So we communicate more by drawing than by talking. And we draw in lots of different ways. So here you can see conventional sketches, you know, big fat felt pen stuff. But on the right, we also draw on top of computer drawings, and we do this live on projection screens, not on bits of paper. You do lots of computer modeling. On the left, you can see a sort of skeletal model, in the middle a rendered model, and on the right, from the same models, you can produce rapid prototype physical models, you know, at scale. And every time we go to Barcelona, which before the pandemic was once a month, there'll be a new set of models for whatever it was we were considering designing. And these are models of our own, showing construction stages of the towers, how you build it one by one. And here are two more models. The left-hand one is a model made by the builder. This is a one-to-one scale model of one of the connections, where he's finding out how easy is it to get the bolts in. You know, is this a sensible way of making this connection? And on the right is a model made by the architect, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I hope, because they've made a model where all the stone blocks are individual rapid prototype pieces, and then they've threaded a little rod through the middle, and you can see the spanner in the foreground for doing it up. And I think they were just checking that this structural idea of post-tension panels actually worked, you know, that to get a feel for it, if you will. And then lastly, this is a sketch by our project director, Steve McKechnie, showing he's developed a way of sketching, you know, which is idiosyncratic. It's purely Steve on an iPad, and it's a cartoon. But the wonderful thing on an iPad is you can zoom in and out, rub out things you don't like, correct them a bit. It's not perfect, but it absolutely conveys all the information that he's trying to convey. And I think the point I'm trying to make here is some of my generation will say that you have to be able to sketch with a felt pen to design. And my view is that is not true. You have to be able to communicate to design, but it doesn't matter how you communicate, as long as you can communicate clearly and get your message across. And actually having lots of a variety of communication methods is even better than a singular one. So we've now got to the point that we know what we're trying to do, and how do we then build it, which of course we're thinking about all the time, but this is sort of the conclusion of that. So the first point is that by using modern BIM technology, we can absolutely define what we want to the nearest millimeter, every single or fraction of a millimeter. Every component is absolutely represented in the model to all, you know, every part of it, every nut, every bolt, every weld, you know, every component of the stonework. And this is a complete change in my lifetime. When I started, our construction drawings were representations of reality that took a good deal of interpretation to actually build. But now, we can specify the whole thing. So how do you then make it? Well, you start with these big blocks of stone. The stone is now coming from all over the world. It used to only come from Montjuic Hill, but the Montjuic quarry closed down in the 70s. And so stone now is sourced from all over the place instead. And then we get this diamond tip bandsaw, which is controlled by a computer directly from the models I've just been showing you, the BIM models. And ironically, it can cut stone to any shape you want, provided it's a ruled surface, because the bandsaw itself is a straight line. You can orient that straight line any way you want in space, but it can still only cut a ruled surface. So I think it's wonderful that today's technology is absolutely perfect for Gaudi's geometry. And I would say this isn't actually a Sagrada bandsaw. This is an example of one in a Carrara marble factory in Italy, but the principle is exactly the same. On the left, you see one of our bandsaws, which works differently. It uses a vertical up and down action for the saw, and a turntable that rotates about 3 axes and slides backwards and forwards. But the result is exactly the same. We can cut anything, provided it's a ruled surface like the block you see on the right. And when we've cut our stone to the nearest millimetre, we then hand finish it like this. So we combine our really latest up-to-date technology with craftsmanship that hasn't changed for 1,000 years. And that gives you these stones you see on the right, that the front face is hand split in the way it always would have been, not just for the life of this project, but I say all medieval or Gothic cathedrals. And I also like the fact that on the top you can see a cardboard template, which is still used to check the final product, even though it's been cut by a computer. So using these techniques, we go into a sort of mass production. These are the most complicated stones on the project. They are the lintel pieces that sit at the top of each panel. And this is the builder's video. So this is made by the builder to exactly, precisely determine how to put it together, how all the pieces go in. These are the anchor blocks for the rods going at each end. This is a laser cut plywood template that goes on top to locate the anchor blocks exactly within the stonework before they are then glued into place with epoxy glue, which is what you see being applied here. So there's a filler piece and then injection in behind that. You then get the gluing in of each of the other blocks. So this video is absolutely meticulous in covering every step of the construction. It has to be then cooked for 8 hours at 22 degrees and 24 hours at 40 degrees to cure the epoxy properly. Then we can take the templates off. We can put in the actual rods that are going to do the post tensioning. We put their nuts on initially loosely. Then we come along with a jack, hydraulic jack, which is mounted on a stool. In that comes, it's done up. We connect the hydraulic hoses. Here we go. Pump the jack. Stretch the rod, do up the retaining nut, release the hydraulic pressure, take off the jack and cut off the extra bit of bar that we don't need anymore. Then we inject the cavity around the rod with cementitious material just to fill the void. The rod is actually made of a duplex stainless steel, which should last indefinitely. It's pretty impervious to corrosion. But just in case, we also fill the void with a cementitious material. And that's how you make a lintel. And here you can see in practice a very short video showing exactly those steps then happening in reality and in the physical world. So everything's worked out in the virtual world and then it's performed in the physical world. And one advantage of all of this is not only do you think through the whole process before you begin, but you can also expand your construction team, because this is effectively a training video. It shows everybody who joins the project what they have to do. And so here you get the resulting lintels, complete with their post-tension steel and the anchor blocks ready to take the vertical bars. And here's a video of then assembly of a panel itself. And that template at the bottom is the same template used for the top of the panel below. And this is the way we make sure that each panel fits precisely one above the other. And then along comes the world's best bricklayer, and you mortar up the joint and you put on the next piece of stone, and so on and so forth until you get to the top of the panel. And then we start inserting the rods. Some of them have to go in from the bottom, so they're dropped in first. Then on goes the lintel itself. This is the one we just saw being pre-made, the block across the top. Then we insert 2 more rods, we tighten them up, and we post tension them with jacks, just like the ones you saw before. So in reality, what's that look like? Well, it looks a bit like this. So this is the stainless steel components arriving for one panel, and these are all being made off-site. So part of what we're doing here is moving the stonemason's yard, the timber yard, the concrete batching plant, all to an off-site location where we prefabricate large components that are then going to be site assembled. So this is the prefabrication, and we're using, you get in a box on the left, as you see, everything you need for one panel, just like IKEA on a slightly larger scale. Here's the jig that's made up so we can make 14 panels, one whole row of the Mary Tower at once. Here you can see these are the little stainless steel shear keys that fit through the plywood template and locate one panel above another. In the background, you see another template being used to make the window, to make sure that the window will fit into the rebates in the stone. And here you see the successful manufacture of one row, in this case, Evangelist Tower panels, pre-glazed, off-site, and then brought to site on the back of a lorry. And this was the magic moment when they put the first panel on the Mary Tower. And the construction program allowed 1 hour to put in one panel. And I thought the first panel would therefore probably take about 4 hours because they'd not done one before. And I was so pleased when they did this one in 38 minutes. You know, the very first panel only took 38 minutes to assemble. You can see on the right those shear keys, the little balls that fit into the holes in the panel above. And when I say fit, they fit with a 1 millimeter tolerance. Because our theory is that if we can make everything accurately and put it together accurately on site, we never have to adjust anything or measure anything on site. We just have to keep assembling, just like building something from Lego. You just trust it to be accurate and to fit together. Here you see a couple of the big panels. This is now the Jesus Tower, the big tower, because having developed a technique and an approach for the Mary Tower, which is essential because of its weight limit, the decision was taken to use that on all 6 towers because it was a good strategy, it was a good process, it worked. So these panels are now 25 tons each. They come to site in the early hours of the morning because you have to have road closures to let the big trucks through, and they get lifted up. And I'm very grateful for Time magazine for producing this video for us of one of the big 25-ton panels being lifted up. And it's a pity in a way that this happens in the early hours of the morning, because at this point we have changed construction from a noisy, polluting, messy process with a lot of on-site adjustment and labour to a precision assembly process which is relatively quiet and non-polluting, with not that many people required on-site. And it actually goes further than that. My theory is that this is actually, you know, can be made into a performance or a piece of theatre, and it's actually something that people will be attracted to rather than shunning. And this will change, I think, the whole nature of construction and development in the future, where construction is no longer seen as an evil necessity, but actually something that people enjoy watching and seeing progress. And so this is a 25-ton panel, and even these big panels go in less than an hour from beginning to end. And here you see progress on the Mary Tower to the point where now a row of 14 panels can be put in 6 hours. There's no scaffolding required to support the panels. There's some scaffolding required to get access to them, to bolt them up, but they just lift them in and put them down. Here you see the progress on the Mary Tower on the left and the right. It's now slightly taller than the bell towers on the Nativity. facade and the Passion facade, and this is it inside. So we don't have the Hollywood set, we don't have the scaffolding or the tubular structure inside. It is all made of stone, inside and out. And here's a shot actually from the hotel I normally stay in when I go to Barcelona. This is a view from the hotel bedroom of the towers going up, and you can see the Evangelist towers now going up behind the Mary Tower. And in this shot, you get all 6 towers, where in the middle we've got the Jesus Tower with the 25-ton panels underway. So to finish with, I'll just say this is, the project that I've enjoyed, more than any other in my career. I can't believe my luck. I don't understand how I managed to get involved with it, but it's given me more pleasure, I think, than any other project in my life, because it's not just, what you can leave behind. It's the approach you take. So some people say, well, that's all very well for Sagrada, but what relevance is that to my, relatively ordinary project? But actually, I think using technology, using natural low carbon materials, using craftsmanship and love to put more emotional content into what you're doing, and to produce something that hopefully will last a very long time, which sort of suits the circular economy. These are all principles that you can apply to any project, not just Sagrada. So with that, thank you very much.
Amazing. Goodness me. Thank you very much, Tristram. Lots of echo. What's that about? Any idea? Okay, well, we'll see what happens. Oh, gone. Right. So first off, who's paying for it? And how is that being, what are the politics around that?
Well, that's a very good point. So over its life, it used to be paid for by private donations, and one of its what's caused some of the stops and starts is actually a lack of funding. But now, and the reason that gave them the courage to say let's finish it by 2026, it's entirely paid for by tourism. The people who visit the church and pay their 20 euros to go and visit it, that is the cash that pays for its construction. It's a very simple thing, which unfortunately means I'm very sad to say that it is likely that we will now be delayed because there has been no income since February this year.
So yes, I was going to ask, how has COVID affected it? Did it shut down completely?
The construction site has shut down completely. We were hoping to restart the off-site fabrication yard about now, and the on-site assembly in January, and we continued to design the whole way through, but unfortunately I think that is now unlikely to happen because the tourism just hasn't come back yet.
All right. How are you collecting all of the huge amounts of learning that clearly is being done, the innovation in the build, the innovation in the design? How are you able to wrap all of that up? And I mean, certainly as a professional team, this is probably one of the best learning experiences you might ever have had in your career. But sharing it in terms of general knowledge of moving on construction methods and design methods, how can that happen?
That's a very good question, Martin, and I'm always exhorting the team to start publishing technical papers, professional papers, to get it out there. Unfortunately, as most of us probably know, that there's far more interest in doing the next bit of design than there is in recording the design that's already occurred. So we're a bit slow at doing that, but we will be putting some shoulders to that wheel shortly.
I had the pleasure to go and have a tour of the backstage tour of the Bloomberg building just before Christmas, and one of the most interesting things there was, well, for another reason, a very, very, very wealthy client and benefactor of that building, and no budgets to speak of, an awful lot of innovation in the build, and then particularly the M&E and the servicing and lighting, particularly in that building. Has driven some of the suppliers to be able to develop new commercial products, driven by innovation required by brief or required by clients. Any opportunity for that here? Who owns the IP in stuff that's being done there?
Well, the ownership is in the hands of the foundations. They organise the supply chain, so all those, how you cut the stones, all of that is done by themselves. So basically all the IP is with Sagrada, and although I think we probably reserve the right to develop it ourselves for use on other projects. Our view generally is, we're interested in the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, not on replicating what we've already done so much. And we're not sure there's a great big queue of people waiting for monstrous churches, around the world where it can be directly applied. Yeah, but there is a serious point, right? We have a massive challenge as structural engineers as to how to decarbonize structures. So many strides have been made in the operations in buildings. We can now build all electric buildings that are consuming about 10% of the power that they used to, and we can now rely on decarbonising the grid to take the last step and decarbonise operations. But the structure, there is no known path yet to an absolute zero carbon structure.
One assumes that the most modern new buildings are where innovation is delivered, and then the refurb of the old buildings takes all the learning and does that. But clearly, when you get taken around the Bloomberg buildings, and if you can open a window and get to lean out, all they want you to do is look at the stone facade and learn about how that was so innovatively developed. So clearly, you are turning that around and using a particularly heritage building. And what would be handcrafting technology and creating new ways of doing it that are learnable for creating the most modern, and I would wholly celebrate the innovation in stone. I think that's just a lovely thing that you're going to do and need to push. If it's being wholly funded privately by tourism income, still, however, it is one of the most famous things about Barcelona. And so the city authorities and even the Spanish government must clearly understand the potential, the branding potential around the world of such a building. And I'm not sure what's going to happen in Paris as they start to rebuild Notre Dame. And I just imagine if St. Paul's Cathedral fell down or burned. Support from Barcelona City and from the Spanish government, and an understanding that a building like that is at the centre of a national brand?
Unlikely, I think, Martin. I don't necessarily wish it were otherwise. It's just a fact of life. One observation, right? So, in our experience, some of these monumental projects, amazing projects, Pompidou Centre in Paris, the Sydney Opera House, here in Barcelona, it affects people differently. Those a long way away always think they're absolutely brilliant, but those who live nearby don't necessarily share that view. So that the people who live in the neighbourhood of Sagrada are a bit fed up with tourist buses, to be honest. And even however I might say this is construction of theatre, it has to date been a fairly long-serving, slightly noisy and dirty environment, and etc. So it's quite difficult to say that a construction project is a national treasure, even though it looks that way to most of the world. It doesn't always look that way to the people involved. And I think one of the pride of the foundation is that this is a private enterprise. This has always been about being a church for the people, by the people, in effect. We do it on our own. We don't need public support. They don't even have the support financially of the Catholic Church.
Right. Wow. Okay, so I've got so many questions that I could ask you, but I'm aware that we've got an audience and they are piling in with their questions. So I'm going to, even though I'm in charge, I'm going to start asking you my questions. So Stephen asks the $1 million question that is coming. Are you on track to complete by 2026? Given that you had to speed up, I'm in an extraordinary speed up factor of 10. Are you on track?
Well, the good news was that we were on track in February of 2020.
Okay, there you go. I'll leave it at that. When you're working in concrete and steel, the strength characteristics can be controlled accurately. You talked an awful lot about how you manage that with stone. Do you test every panel What are the safety factors that you're applying as you build at the speed at which you're building?
We test stone cubes from every block of stone, and we rely a lot on the very close visual examination of every stone to make sure it's flawless from a visual perspective, which fortunately tends to work very well as a structural check as well. So, and then lastly, the stresses that we impose on the panel when we post tension it as we pull the rods is in effect a load test in its own right. So they will never experience worse stresses after assembly than they did during being assembled.
Right. The glory facade. I'll ask you which one that is in a minute. Was that completely designed by Gaudí, and who is involved in finishing it off and creating it?
So the glory facade is our current design endeavour. It's the main entrance. It's the one down at the south end of the church with that enormous canopy that overhangs the street.
Right.
We have very little information on the glory facade because it wasn't designed. The design was nowhere near completion when Gaudí died. We have a few sketches. The sketches are contradictory, and so it's all a matter of interpretation. There are some rules. If a model exists, we follow the model. If drawings exist, we try and follow the drawings. If nothing exists, then we try and interpret what we think Gaudí might have done. And then there's a choice next, which is what he might have done in 1926 or what he might have done if he were alive today.
Is it a bit like somebody writing the next James Bond book?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Here's a good one. Do you think if Gaudí had then had the knowledge of the modern methods and technologies we have now, that the building would have been designed differently? I know that you can't. If you were in a courtroom, somebody would have objected to that and said, "How could you know what was in Gaudí's mind?" I had the pleasure of going and having a rooftop tour of Westminster Abbey with John Burton when he was the keeper of the fabric some years ago. And what was so fascinating walking inside the roof void over the ceilings was listening to him talk about looking and seeing all of the, particularly the architectural repairs that had happened over the centuries that building has been standing, and an ability now in the 21st century to understand whether any of them would ever have worked at all, given how we can assess those using technology now. And so interesting that they were done, like I suppose restoring paintings, with full confidence that they were right and would work. And in fact, some of them they know now caused more damage to the buildings than they caused repair. I presume Gaudí would have been beside himself with excitement at the technology that he'd been able to employ to design his buildings.
Yes, I think, Martin, we can be reasonably sure that Gaudí would want to deploy the technology available. So, and I can give you, a good sort of straight-on example of that. This last slide I showed you, those decorative pinnacles in the front, the pinnacles of the, in this case, the Passion facade, they are actually made of concrete in the 20s. Well, the ones on the other side, the Nativity facade, are at least. And of course, concrete was a totally newfangled material at that time, and it was actually cement was the way that Mr. Güell, Gaudí's patron, made a lot of his money. So I can be fairly confident, I think, that without getting into Gaudí's mind, that he did actually want to use things that were new. And indeed, one of the schemes for the Mary Tower, which didn't happen, was to make it out of titanium, not use stone at all, to get right. If we can't do monumental masonry, why not just do something completely different?
And so you've talked to us so much about BIM and creating new technology to be able to realise the designs that you've got and that you can turn into a buildable scheme. Do you think if Gaudí had not come a cropper under that tram and there had not been a war and the money had kept flowing, that he would have been able to build the building that he sketched and designed?
Yes, he never intended, though, for it to be constructed in his lifetime. He wrote that he expected future generations to interpret his designs in their execution. He didn't even expect them to follow precisely what he'd drawn. But I do think it would have been finished, in the middle of the last century, had it not been interrupted by his death, by the wars, etc., and by the lack of money. Money was always going to be the main driver, of progress.
So we've had one correspondent of many questions. Xavier asks, did you feel you went through Tuckman's stages of forming, storming, norming and performing, or was there right away a common desire and energy to jump into the performing stage? Do you know what that means? No. I don't.
Well, I sort of do. No, you always, well, for me, look, right, so I'm a bit of an advocate, even though at first I didn't sort of get it, but I do now. The double diamond approach, advocated by the Design Council in the UK, I think, that is actually what happens. You have to understand the brief by expanding the possibilities and then coming down and actually deciding what it is you're trying to achieve. And then you go into expansive mode again in terms of how to achieve it. What are the possibilities and the opportunities? And again, then you have to converge on what you're going to do, So no, I don't think you go straight into performance. You go through a lot of these, ups and downs, and are we doing the right thing? Are we not doing the right thing? Are there better opportunities available? But after a while you converge and you say, right, this is what we're going to
do. Steve asks you, are all the towers glazed, or will they allow wind to pass through in some areas?
All the towers are glazed.
Right.
It's a simple answer to that. But the bell towers on the Glory facade, which are the last 4 apostles, the bell towers are 12 apostles in the end, 4 for each entrance, will be unglazed and open, as are the current bell towers.
Adam asks, how far away, how many years away do you think we are from using this sophistication of design to fabrication on more typical smaller commercial projects, for example, local public buildings?
I think we're within tasting or touching distance. In other words, it's right in front of us. All the technology exists, all the tools exist. It's just a matter of imagination and willpower now to put it into action. The handicap always in construction is a diverse set of players and multiple players all the way through a project. There's a tendency to do what we know how to do and not to do what's possible, because we all have to agree on that, if you see what I mean, and that's quite hard when not all the players are even around the table yet. And there is another small handicap, which is, for me, the ideal material to be using on modest scale projects is timber. Timber gives us a huge carbon advantage of some carbon sequestration, but it is also cheap and easy to mill and machine accurately. But we've got the problem that it's combustible, and that's still, exactly how we deal with that is still being determined. And things like Grenfell, brought that into sharp focus, and the need to fully understand its properties and behaviours before committing to it on a large scale.
Okay. How did you assess what the existing load capacity of the foundations that you inherited? Particularly,
yeah, it's a very good question. I can tell you have a structural engineer in the audience somewhere, because it is a very difficult one.
Richard is known as.
How do you support your work on somebody else's work, and what guarantees do you have of their work? In our case, it's relatively simple, because everything we are building is being supported on the work of 2BMFG, who, as I said, have been working on the project for the last 25 years, and therefore we simply do it in partnership and trust each other, and as a combined unit, we have everything that we need.
Here's a philosophical question. So Charlotte asks you about you mentioned the theological versus the physical construction challenges and considerations. Have there been any concepts that you've had to completely rethink as a result of that tension between the theology and the build? And if so, can you talk about how that gets wrangled?
Well, it's a very simple one, unfortunately, Charlotte. It's not difficult. If I come up with a proposal that doesn't work theologically, we just don't progress it. It's a very cut and dried one. Theology comes first, in effect. So the one I quoted was actually real. It's support for the Glory facade canopy has 7 columns drawn on it, and I suggested it could be supported by 4 columns just as readily, and the answer is no. Theologically it's 7. Although we did get one the other way around. There was a horizontal slab halfway up the Jesus Tower, which was described as separating your journey to heaven into 3 stages, and after a lot of debate, we agreed actually it was a better architectural and experiential thing not to have that slab, and it was unnecessary structurally, if you see what I mean. So I just put in the first piece of paper that says we don't need it. Then there's the big debate as to what's the consequence of that.
All right, here's a good question. It's a good question. I'm not sure you're going to find an answer to it, but we'll have a go. St. Francis is said to have looked at his beloved Assisi upside down to observe its fragility. And apparently Gaudi designed his building upside down to invert tension into compression for structural integrity. How has your experience on the Sagrada best turned your perspective of architecture for the future upside down? Maybe I'll just add to that and say, you know, like me, you are a little nearer to the retirement end of your career than you are to the beginning end of your career. What lessons are you going to take from this project that you might pass on to those at the other end of their career?
I think the thing that's turned upside down for me, and it wasn't just Sagrada, but Sagrada sort of capped it, is I started my life as an absolute devotee of minimalism and technology.
Okay, then.
How can you make the lightest and most efficient possible structure, you know, for any given situation? And of course, using computers to their utmost to help you get to that point. And what I see at Sagrada is that it's not about that. It's about the experience that people will get from the buildings you've contributed to. That is what counts. And so in this case, it's using technology to make things, you know, reasonably efficient, but it's craft and stone and natural materials and love and passion and decoration and all sorts of things I thought I had no affinity for, you know, that actually are the important things in life.
I suppose, well, I'll just refer back to my fantastic visits to Westminster Abbey and looking at some of those ceilings and understanding with what joy they got to their technological solutions about how to create those incredibly heavy stone ceilings. And then they just went to town and deciding how they might then embellish them because they could. And of course, you stand underneath those things. And even if you love the most beautiful, simple, modern, concrete, simplistic buildings, how can you not stand under those ceilings and look up and break your neck with the joy and pleasure of just looking at them and being underneath them? And I suppose a bit of that for you, right?
No, exactly. And I was actually upset at one time by our shafts, if I can call them that, the bits of the towers we're currently constructing to this panelized, you know, repetitive processes, because I thought, well, where's the craft and the love component of that? You know, have we reduced it too much? And I'm glad to say that once we finish the shafts, we have the decorative spires on top, which will go back to being, you know, purely about decoration and beauty and, you know, flourish on the top.
You know, in our world of quick building, where we are and where our conversation about planning and heritage and vernacular and design, and we think about, you know, it takes 18 months to build an office block to a contemporary design. You might hope that that won't be pulled down in 10 years time and it might still be standing in 100 years time. But I was again just at Blenheim, and you completely throw away that when somebody tells you the dates, not that it took to build it, you know, from laying the first stone to then the Duke of Marlborough being dead long before it was ever finished. And then you think, bloody hell, you know, God, those developers in those days, they didn't not have to worry about how long it took to build a building. You know, you've got in your hands now a building that was designed all that time ago, but is being built with the most incredible modern technology now that is realizing a historic design. What's the heritage you're leaving behind in that building?
I guess, I don't know. Personally, I think everything you design, you put a bit of yourself into, you know, you put a bit of your soul. And that's the wonderful thing about designing the built environment, is you can go around and look at things that you've had something to do with. And it doesn't matter how much or how little you've had to do with. You can still think, you know, that's only the way it is in some detail or other because of me, you know, and you get this wonderful sense of pride. Sagrada in particular obviously amplifies that. But the main thing for me is to diligently and as far as possible try and match up to our clients' aspirations, which is not for a 50-year life and not for a 100-year life, but to be as durable as it can be, you know, an indefinite life, if you like. And if you think about what we all have to do, and I'm going to just come back to your, the heritage introduction. One of the strategies for us as structural engineers to reduce the carbon content of our structures is simply to keep existing structures in use, to continually adapt and refurbish and change what we already have, rather than building new all the time. And even if we do build new, we have to use the material that's already made, not make new material. And these are all strategies we're wrestling with now, but by the time we get to 2050, that has to be what we're doing.
We talked before we went live with our event before about our shared history at Dartington Hall in Devon, where you grew up and where I was lucky enough to be looking after that estate for nearly 3 years until recently. One of the most interesting things for me being there and looking after a portfolio of buildings that ranged from 20th century delivery to 14th century delivery was how not simple it was to present a set of proposals to Historic England or planners or design and conservation officers. So Dartington Hall itself, built in 1388, whenever I wanted to change anything, had to present 600 years of development on that site and debate which bits of that development was most significant. And if you thought that it was the oldest, well, you'd be sadly wrong. And so to put that together with what you've just said about what's the heritage of the future. So, for instance, at Notre Dame, should they put the spire back on or not? There's a question here from Steve. Do you think in the future, with the designs employed on this project, that York Minster could be finished as originally designed with a spire? What do you think about mucking around with buildings that we know so well as they are now that might not have been as the original designers intended, or might have been changed? And is there an argument for putting them back?
Yeah, very interesting question, Martin. So I'll just give sort of two observations. I think, I think we love heritage, but why do we love heritage? I think it makes us feel comfortable, and it's because we like the feel of being amongst it. And it's quite interesting which heritage we choose to love. I've always been fascinated by the fact that we prefer our Georgian houses in London to our Victorian ones. The Victorian ones are functionally superior. They let in more light with their bay windows. They have kitchens poking out the back and light wells. And actually the Georgian ones with basements and straight fronts and backs, a lot of ways less functional, but we like them because I think they look better. So there's something about beauty in amongst this as well, about what we should keep and what we shouldn't keep. But to me, generally, I'm fairly laid back and feel that we should have the confidence to believe that we can improve on things. And provided we're respectful of what already exists, why wouldn't we want to improve upon them? So this conversation's never come up at Sagrada, but it could. You could say from a heritage standpoint, you should stop building. Yeah?
Yes. If
you take heritage literally, and yet luckily nobody's tried to do that. They have queried whether we have building permission, which is another matter. But we can. So continuous improvement, I think, is what we should be doing. We shouldn't deliberately, destroy things that are important, but we should be quite discerning as to what is important, because we shouldn't cut off the future in favour of the past.
Great, thank you. I'm super aware of how much of your time we've taken this afternoon, and I can't tell you how grateful I am to you for coming and talking to all of us about your amazing, extraordinary project. It makes me want to just go and move to Barcelona and join in with you. I'll just leave. Also, I'll say thank you so very, very much. And I'll say thank you to everybody who was able to join us and listen to and learn from that extraordinary conversation. I'll just leave you with the one anonymous question. Well, it's not a question really, it's a comment that was left by one of your audience that says, in relation to the COVID delays, please don't worry, because Gaudi apparently said, my client God is in no hurry. So I'm sure you know that quote, but worth it for everybody else. So I think we'll just wrap up there. So Tristram, thank you really a lot. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and
Okay.
thank you everybody for listening.